actually made the models better.
Is yes. And I think that's one of the overlooked lessons. Simons wasn't just solving math problems, he was building a culture. He knew he needed outsiders, people who weren't trained in traditional finance, that gave them an edge. If he'd just hired Wall Street veterans, Medallion Fund might never have happened.
Let me throw you an imaginary question then. Suppose you were in charge of hiring for Renaissance back in the 1980s. You had to choose between a brilliant mathematician with no finance experience and a seasoned investor who knows markets inside out. Who would you pick?
I'd go with the mathematician because if the whole point is to find patterns invisible to the human eye, then traditional finance knowledge might even be a handicap. The investor would bring biases. The mathematician would bring curiosity and tools.
But don't you think having zero market sense could also be risky? What if they misinterpret signals as patterns that don't really exist?
Fair point. Maybe the right answer is what Simons actually did, put them together. The math guys to find the patterns, and then a few people with finance intuition to stress test whether those patterns made any practical sense.
That balance is crucial. And what's striking is how often Simons let the math win, even when intuition said otherwise. The book describes how sometimes the algorithms suggested moves that felt completely wrong to humans. But sticking with the system made Renaissance the most successful hedge fund ever.
It's almost philosophical, isn't it? Like a battle between human intuition and machine logic. Simons chose to trust the machine.
I want to pause there, because this raises a question that bothered me while reading. If Simons proved that markets can be beaten systematically, doesn't that contradict the efficient market hypothesis?
Oh, absolutely. Efficient market theory says prices already reflect all available information, so you can't consistently beat the market. But Renaissance proved otherwise, though maybe not in the way most people think.
Explain what you mean.
Well, markets are efficient in a broad sense. If you or I tried to pick stocks, chances are we'd lose to the index. But Simons wasn't picking stocks based on fundamentals. He was exploiting micro patterns, anomalies, temporary mispricings. So maybe markets are efficient at the big picture level, but not at the micro level where Renaissance operated.
So you're saying markets are efficient for humans, but not necessarily for machines with the right data and algorithms.
Exactly. It's like trying to play chess against a grandmaster. As a beginner, you think you have no chance, but then someone brings in an A like stockfish. Suddenly, the game isn't the same anymore.
Nice analogy, but then doesn't that create an uneven playing field? I mean, if only a few firms have that level of technology, aren't the rest of us just background noise in the market?
That's the uncomfortable part. Yes, it does create inequality. The book makes it clear Renaissance was essentially printing money for its insiders. Meanwhile, the average investor has no access to those tools.
Here's a thought experiment then. If Jim Simmons offered you a job at Renaissance in its early days, but told you it would mean secrecy, intense pressure, and no ability to publicly share your work, would you take it?
Oh man, tough one. On the one hand, working with those minds and making that kind of money would be incredible. But on the other hand, I value intellectual openness. Renaissance was like a fortress of secrecy. I think part of me would have said no.
Interesting. I think I'd have said yes, not for the money necessarily, but just to see how far math can push finance.
But then remember, some people inside Renaissance weren't happy despite the success. A few left because they didn't like the spite, the secrecy, or the lack of recognition outside. Money isn't everything.
True. And that brings me to another theme from the book, the idea of purpose. Simons made billions, but he also seemed restless, almost searching for meaning. Do you think his biggest achievement was the money, or was it proving that math could solve a seemingly unsolvable problem?
I'd argue it was the latter. The money was just a byproduct. Simons showed that with enough data and the right models, you could tackle even the wild, chaotic thing we call the market. That's revolutionary.
And yet, it raises ethical questions. Renaissance was so secretive and so powerful that it almost feels like they were bending reality. Is that fair, or is that just capitalism at work?
Depends on your perspective. Some would say it's unfair because regular people can't compete. Others would say it's fair because anyone could have tried what Simons tried. It just required vision and persistence.
Chris, you just mentioned ethics, and that's something I kept circling back to while reading. Renaissance's medallion fund was so successful that it basically shut its doors to outsiders. They only let employees invest. Imagine if Simons had opened it up widely. Ordinary people could have benefited, but he didn't. Do you think that was selfish?
It's complicated. On the surface, yes, it feels selfish. Here's this money machine, but only insiders can use it. But from a practical angle, it made sense. The strategies worked best at a certain scale. If too much money poured in, the edges would disappear. So limiting investors was actually protecting the system.
I get that. But doesn't it still leave a bitter taste? Billions of dollars being generated, and instead of helping society directly, it was just enriching a small circle.
True. Though, to be fair, Simons did later channel much of his wealth into philanthropy, supporting science education, autism research. Maybe that was his way of balancing the scales.
That's worth highlighting. In fact, the book makes the point that Simon seemed more motivated by discovery than greed. He wanted to see if the math worked. The money was fuel, not the end goal.
Yeah, and I admire that because think about it, once you're a billionaire several times over, money stops being interesting. It becomes about legacy, about pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
Let me push you on this, though. If you had the chance to build a system like Medallion, would you cap it the way Simons did, or would you open it to the public, even if it diluted the returns?
Honestly, I'd cap it. Because if you spread it too wide, the model might collapse, and then no one benefits. It's like running a small restaurant with the best food in town. If you suddenly scale to a massive chain, the quality suffers.
I like that analogy. Keep it small to keep it special.
Exactly.
Another thing that stood out was how often Renaissance's system contradicted human instincts. Like the models would say, buy, when everyone else was panicking. I kept wondering, could I personally stick to the model in those moments? Or would I chicken out?
That's the real test, isn't it? Trusting a machine over your gut. I think most of us would struggle. You see red flashing on the screen, markets crashing, and some algorithm is telling you, don't worry, hold, or even buy. It takes discipline and maybe even a kind of detachment to follow that.
Maybe that's why Simons hired mathematicians instead of traders. Traders live on adrenaline and emotion. Mathematicians live on equations.
Exactly. Mathematicians are used to believing the math, even when their gut says otherwise. That mindset was key.
Let me throw a hypothetical at you. Imagine you're in 2008 during the financial crisis. The whole market is melting down. You're sitting at Renaissance, and the model says, buy mortgage-backed securities. Would you follow it?
I'd probably freeze. My instinct would scream, no way. But if I were really committed to the philosophy, I'd remind myself the model has no fear, no panic, just data. And historically, trusting it paid off.
That's the thing, though. Most of us don't have that kind of faith, which is why Renaissance was in a league of its own.
And it's also why most investors underperform. They get scared, they chase fads, they sell at the wrong time. Renaissance removed that human flaw.
Speaking of flaws, the book talks about how even Simons had to deal with massive volatility early on. They lost money, they doubted themselves. It wasn't an overnight success.
Yes, and that's another lesson. People see the billions now, but in the early years, it was messy. False starts, bad trades, arguments among the team. Success wasn't linear.
Which reminds me of something Simons said: past performance is the best predictor of future performance until it's not. I love that paradox.
Oh, I love that line too. It captures the fragility of their success. Their models worked until one day they wouldn't. The challenge was constant adaptation.
And that's what separates them from copycats. Lots of firms tried to mimic Renaissance, but they failed because they couldn't keep evolving.
Yes, because Renaissance wasn't a single formula. It was a living, breathing system, always adjusting. That's hard to replicate.
Let's pivot for a second. What do you think Simon's story says about the future of work? Because he proved that outsiders with math and data skills can outsmart traditional experts. Does that mean in other fields, medicine, law, even art, we'll see similar revolutions?
I think so. Simons showed the power of cross-pollination, bringing people from outside a field to see problems differently. In medicine, data scientists are already finding patterns doctors miss. In law, tools are scanning cases faster than lawyers. The lesson is, don't just rely on insiders. Outsiders often see what insiders are blind to.
So, in a way, Simons wasn't just solving the market. He was showing a new way of thinking.
Yes, a mindset shift. Trust data, question assumptions, embrace outsiders.
That makes me wonder, what if Simons had chosen a different field? Say, climate science instead of finance. Do you think he could have cracked climate prediction with the same methods?
Fascinating question. I think he might have, because at the end of the day, it's all patterns, markets, weather, climate. They're complex systems full of hidden signals. Simon's gift was in extracting those signals. If he devoted himself to climate, maybe we'd have even better models today.
That's both inspiring and a little sad. Inspiring because it shows what's possible, but sad because so much brainpower was spent on making a few people rich instead of solving global problems.
Yeah, that's the trade-off. Finance was lucrative, so it attracted talent. But imagine if Renaissance level minds had worked on healthcare or energy. The world might look different.
So here's a personal challenge question for you. If you had Simon's level of genius and resources, what problem would you choose to tackle outside of finance?
I'd probably choose education. I think our education systems are still operating like it's the 19th century. Imagine building data-driven, personalized learning for every child. That could change society in a massive way.
I love that, and it ties back to Simon's too, because he did invest in education later through philanthropy.
Right? Maybe deep down he also felt finance wasn't enough.
That's what makes his story human. Brilliant, yes, but also restless, searching.
And that's probably why his biography resonates. It's not just numbers, it's a man chasing meaning.
Chris, one thing that really fascinated me in the book was how Renaissance embraced secrecy. Everything was locked down. Employees signed strict agreements. Hardly anyone spoke to the press. And the strategies were guarded like state secrets. Do you think that kind of secrecy was necessary, or did it border on paranoia?
I'd say both. Secrecy was absolutely necessary because their edge depended on no one else knowing what they were doing. If their methods leaked, the patterns would have disappeared. But at the same time, it definitely had a paranoid feel. Imagine working in a place where you can't even casually talk about your work with outsiders. It creates a weird, almost cult-like environment.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Some people thrived in that environment while others couldn't handle it. And I kept thinking, does secrecy limit innovation? Because if you're not allowed to share ideas freely, Maybe you miss opportunities for collaboration.
That's a great point. Secrecy can protect but also isolate. Maybe Renaissance was a special case because the prize was so massive, billions at stake. But in general, I think openness leads to more breakthroughs.
It makes me wonder about the trade-off. Is it better to protect knowledge tightly or share it widely?
Depends on the field. In finance, secrecy gives you an edge. In science, openness accelerates progress. Simon straddled both worlds. He was a scientist first, then a financier. Maybe that's why he poured so much into funding open scientific research later, as if to balance the closed world of Renaissance.
That balance is interesting. Let me ask you an imaginary scenario. Suppose you're running a research lab that discovers an algorithm capable of predicting stock prices with 95% accuracy. Would you keep it secret and profit, or would you publish it for the world to see?
Oh, that's brutal. The selfish side of me says profit, but the idealist in me says publish, because it would change economics forever. But realistically, I'd probably split the difference. Profit for a while, then publish once the edge starts fading.
I like that honesty. I think most people would do the same.
What about you?
I'd probably lean toward publishing, but with conditions. Like maybe use the money to fund global problems and then release the knowledge. Because otherwise, you're just creating a tiny island of wealth in a sea of inequality.
That's exactly the ethical tensions Simons faced, and I think that's why people still debate his legacy.
Speaking of legacy, the book shows how Simons, despite his success, wasn't exactly a charismatic leader. He wasn't some Steve Jobs type visionary. He was quiet, almost awkward, and yet he inspired loyalty. What do you think made people follow him?
I think it was his humility. For a man so brilliant, he didn't act like he had all the answers. He trusted his team, gave them freedom, and admitted mistakes. That kind of leadership is rare, especially in finance.
True, he wasn't the loudest in the room, but he built the smartest room.
Exactly. And that's a powerful lesson for anyone leading a team. Your job isn't to have the answers, it's to create an environment where the best answers can emerge.
I like that. Let's shift to something else. The volatility of the models. Renaissance often held positions for just days, even hours. That's very different from traditional investing. Do you think that short-termism has negative effects on markets overall?
It can. High frequency and short term trading can create noise, liquidity, and sometimes even instability. But it also makes markets more efficient in a way. Renaissance wasn't trying to destabilize. They were exploiting small inefficiencies. The bigger question is whether this kind of trading benefits society.
Right. Because while they were making billions, what was society getting in return?
Not much directly, but indirectly, their trades added liquidity and smoothed out some market inefficiencies, though I'd argue that pales in comparison to the wealth concentrated in their hands.
Yeah, it's a moral gray zone.
Exactly.
Another aspect that struck me was how Renaissance thrived on diversity of thought. The team was a mix of mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, even linguists. Do you think that mix was the secret sauce?
Absolutely. Diversity of expertise allowed them to see patterns others missed. A physicist might approach randomness differently than a linguist. When you combine those perspectives, you get insights no single field could produce.
That makes me think about our own world today. Companies often talk about diversity, but usually in surface terms, gender, ethnicity. Renaissance showed that intellectual diversity, different ways of thinking, can be just as important.
Yes, and maybe even more powerful in some contexts. You need people who challenge assumptions, who see the same problem through a different lens.
Let's play another scenario. Imagine you're assembling a dream team to solve a massive global problem, say curing cancer. Would you pick all biologists Or would you bring in mathematicians, engineers, maybe even philosophers?
I'd go for the mix, because biology alone might miss the big picture patterns. Mathematicians might see structures in the data. Engineers might design tools to test theories. Philosophers might even ask questions no one thought to ask. That mix creates breakthroughs.
So in a way, Renaissance was a proof of concept for solving other big challenges too.
Yes, and that's what excites me. Simon's success wasn't just about money. It was about showing the power of interdisciplinary collaboration.
But here's where I push back. Collaboration is great, but doesn't too much disagreement slow progress? Renaissance had huge arguments internally.
True, but disagreement isn't necessarily bad. As long as it's handled constructively, it sharpens ideas. Renaissance's culture allowed debate without ego. That's rare.
So maybe the lesson is embrace disagreement, but don't let it become dysfunction.
Exactly.
Another subtle theme in the book is luck. Simons had timing on his side, computers were advancing, data was becoming available, markets were ripe for quant approaches. Do you think Renaissance would have succeeded if he started 20 years earlier?
Probably not. The technology just wasn't there. Luck played a role, no doubt, but I'd argue he also created his own luck by being prepared when the opportunity came.
Yeah, that's the classic luck favors the prepared mind.
Exactly.
Let me ask you something personal. After reading about Renaissance, do you feel more optimistic or pessimistic about the idea of beating the market yourself?
Pessimistic, honestly. Because if the smartest people with the best machines are already coming through every signal, what chance do I have? The takeaway for me is don't try to beat the market. Invest simply, cheaply, and let compounding do the work.
I agree. In a way, Simon's story isn't a playbook for ordinary investors. It's almost a warning.
Yes, a reminder that the game is tilted. So instead of trying to outsmart Renaissance, better to just accept the limits and play a different game.
That's sobering, but also liberating.
Exactly.
So, Chris, we've covered secrecy, ethics, teamwork, even luck. But there's one last angle I think we need to talk about, the human side of Jim Simmons. The book paints him as brilliant, but also flawed. He had family tragedies. He wasn't always the best at relationships. Do you think his genius came at a personal cost?
I think so. It's almost a cliché, right? Brilliance in one domain often means imbalance in another. A Simons poured so much energy into solving the markets that maybe he couldn't fully solve the puzzles of his personal life.
Yeah, that struck me too. And it made me wonder, would you trade a normal, balanced life for a genius-level achievement like Simon's had? Billions in wealth, a revolutionary legacy, but maybe less peace at home.
That's a heavy question. My instinct says no. I'd choose balance. What's the point of billions if you're not happy in the quiet moments?
I respect that, but part of me thinks I might take the deal, not for the money, but for the idea of leaving behind something transformative.
That's fair. And maybe that's why people like Simons exist, because they're willing to make sacrifices most of us wouldn't.
That ties into another theme, the idea of obsession. Renaissance was built on obsession with patterns, with data, with perfecting the model. Obsession can create greatness, but it can also consume you.
Right. And that's the double edge. Obsession is fuel, but it can also burn you out. The trick is knowing how to channel it.
Let's spin a scenario. Imagine you had a chance to be part of an obsessive team, like Renaissance, working day and night on a single problem. Would you do it? Even if it meant sacrificing other parts of your life.
If I were younger, maybe yes. For the thrill, for the experience. But now I'd say no. I value balance more.
I think I'd still be tempted. There's something magnetic about being at the edge of discovery.
And that's why Renaissance has attracted the people it did. They weren't just chasing money. They were chasing that feeling of discovery.
Exactly.
But you know what's ironic? Despite all that obsession, secrecy, and brilliance, Simons himself admitted he didn't understand the details of the models in the end. The system became too complex even for him.
Yes! That was wild. He built the machine, but eventually the machine ran itself, beyond even his comprehension.
It raises a deeper question: do we control our creations, or do they end up controlling us?
Chilling thought, especially when you think about A today.
Exactly. Renaissance is like a microcosm of that bigger issue. Humans building systems so complex that even the creators don't fully understand them.
And yet the results were undeniable.
Yes, it worked, even if it was mysterious.
That mystery is what makes the story so compelling. It's not just about numbers, it's about the limits of human understanding.
And maybe that's the ultimate lesson. Markets, like life, are messy and unpredictable. But with patience, data, and collaboration, you can still find patterns worth trusting.
I like that.
Let's not forget another lesson: the importance of persistence. Simons didn't crack it overnight. Years of trial, error, and even failure went into Medallion. It's easy to romanticize the success, but the grind mattered.
Absolutely. Success always looks inevitable in hindsight, but in the moment, it's fragile and uncertain.
Exactly.
Let's wrap with one last hypothetical. Imagine Jim Simmons was sitting here with us right now. What's the one question you'd ask him?
I'd ask him, if you could start over, would you still choose finance, or would you put your genius into science or medicine instead?
Good one. And what do you think he'd say?
I think he might hesitate. Maybe he'd admit finance wasn't the most meaningful choice, but it was the path that allowed him to fund science later.
That's thoughtful.
What would you ask him?
I'd ask, what pattern do you see in life itself beyond markets? Because if anyone could spot hidden structures in the chaos of existence, it might be him.
Wow, that's deep.
Well, the book isn't just about finance, it's about curiosity, about finding order in chaos.
True.
So to close, let's try to distill the key lessons from Simon's story.
Okay. Lesson 1: trust data over intuition, but don't forget that humans still shape the models.
Lesson 2, build diverse teams. Different minds see different patterns.
Lesson 3: persistence matters. Success comes after years of failure and adjustment.
Lesson 4, obsession is powerful, but it comes with costs. Balance matters too.
Lesson 5: secrecy can protect, but openness in the right context drives progress.
And maybe lesson 6, luck and timing are real, but luck favors those who are prepared.
Exactly.
I think if listeners take anything away, it's this: Jim Simmons didn't just solve the market, he showed us a way of thinking. Question assumptions, look for hidden signals, and surround yourself with people who challenge you.
Yes, and remember that even the most complex systems can be approached one pattern at a time.
Beautifully said.
Thanks, David. This was a rich conversation.
Thank you, Chris.